Welcome to On the Brink, a fresh lens to take you and your business to new heights. Hi, I'm Andi Simon, your host or your hostess. And my job is to find people who are going to help you see, feel, and think in new ways. I want you to get off the brink. You can either soar or you can fall, but if you're on that brink and not quite sure where it's going, it's a good day to listen in and think about how our guest today can help you see, feel, and think in new ways. That's my job. Our guest is Shannon Huffman Polson. She's an amazing woman. She says in her little bio here that she's a woman of many firsts. And you're going to hear about them because it's really on the edge of pushing what women can do forward in a very powerful, important way. She's one of the first women to fly Apache combat helicopters in the U.S. Armed Forces. And she served on 3 continents and led 2 flight platoons and a line company. After nearly a decade as an Army officer and attack aviation leader, she transitioned through her MBA at Dartmouth to become a leader and manager in the corporate sector at Gieden and Microsoft. It's very interesting, having been in large companies myself, being an entrepreneur as well. This is an interesting conversation about leadership. And in our leadership academies, I always like to watch and think about the women leaders and men leaders, how they define leadership, how people follow them, because leaders need followers. Very important. So Shannon has turned her attention to the study of leadership. She's the author of The Grit Factor: Courage, Resilience, and Leadership in the Most Male-Dominated Organization in the World. This is going to be fun. And she's founder of the Grit Institute for both men and women, with a robust training program in leadership and grit dedicated to whole leader development in times of challenge and change. And she's an author of The Grit Factor because that's going to be an important part of this whole transformation. So what I'd like you to listen to today is about how in these fast changing times with so much uncertainty, and all my leaders are saying their folks want certainty and there's no certainty. But humans like certainty. They like to see the future and they want to know what's coming, or it's hard to figure out how to act today. They also want to know how to lead so people follow them and follow them in the right way. Shannon, thank you for joining me. It's such a pleasure.
Andi, what a pleasure to be with you with On the Brink.
Well, it's so much fun because Shannon's on the West Coast, am I right? I'm on the East Coast. Thank you, Zoom. I'm never going to Zoom fatigue. It's giving me all kinds of opportunities. Tell the listeners about your own journey, because I think it's important they hear it from you. Now, I can list the things that you've done, but both the grit factor and your own transformation is important to visualize if you're listening and see you if we're doing the video. So please share your story. What's your journey?
Yeah, Andi, it's a long and windy journey, I imagine, like many of your listeners. But I will start back in growing up in Anchorage, Alaska, so quite a long ways, especially from the East Coast and even from where I am today. And then going to become an English major at Duke University in North Carolina. So what I still consider the biggest culture shock of my entire life was at age, actually just 17, moving down to North Carolina from Alaska in the late 1980s. And I was an English major, but more importantly, I ended up joining Army ROTC. And that ended up setting the trajectory of my life that was otherwise completely unexpected. I ended up serving, as you mentioned, 8 years in the military. I led 2 flight platoons in a flight company on 3 different continents as one of the first women to fly the Apache helicopter. And I wouldn't trade the experience for anything. But I ended up leaving the military then to transition through the tech school, as you mentioned. And, leadership has always been a passion of mine. It was a passion of mine even back in high school. And so taking that through from clubs and sports in high school into what became obviously really a leadership training program in the military in many regards, into the corporate world, really has always fascinated me. Those things that are the most pertinent and the most applicable across all of those different types of scenarios, because of course not everything fits all of those different experiences. But one of the things that came out of those experiences for sure was that grit is a key factor of success. And Angela Duckworth has done the research on that, of course. But as I continued forward in my journey, I left Microsoft to write my first book, North of Hope. It's a very personal memoir, certainly about grit as well, but but much more personally addressed. And as I continued to move forward into this writing and wanting to re-engage with leadership and with business, I had a young lieutenant reach out to me right at about the time I was starting to do keynotes. I was starting to speak to organizations across the country, work with leaders on their most pressing issues, which are often around change, often around getting through obstacles and motivating their people that way. And I had a young lieutenant reach out to me, and she asked me to be her mentor as she began flight school at Fort Rucker, Alabama. And I said immediately, I said yes. And then I thought, oh my goodness, my experience was a while ago in the military, and also it was pretty unique. I was the first woman in this all male environment, and so how can I scale the advice that I present to her? And then once I've done that work, because that will be substantial, how can I scale the people to whom that advice is available? And that is really the genesis of what has become the book, The Grit Factor, and what has become the Grit Institute, with the training that is available through the Grit Institute, both in person and also online. And so that's kind of the journey is through a number of crucibles myself, and then realizing through working with others what was really needed and what could really help others in their journeys. That's been, I think, always has been a passion, is finding ways to engage and help others get through the hard times for me.
I'm curious. I often tell people that life is a pathway with aha moments.
Aha.
This woman, does she know how she transformed something? Will you mentor me into a new passion and purpose for you? Because she as much changed you as you were going to help her change. Was she aware of it? And how? I mean, and how did that go through your head with a swish? Because I could hear the aha moment going, "Oh my gosh, I just had an epiphany. This isn't about one. This is about many." How did that all take place for you?
Yeah, and I'm a slow study sometimes. I have a thick skull. So I think I end up diving into the work and doing the work. And then as I'm in the midst of that work, I think things start to reveal themselves. And that's been the
Ah.
case for me in many different circumstances. And I think this was the case here, because initially my thought was, okay, I'm going to start to interview other leaders in the vanguard of their military fields. So as part of the Grit Factor, I've interviewed several dozen women in the vanguard of their military fields, early women general officers, a submariner, a Coast Guard rescue swimmer, one of the first women Army Rangers, this incredible cohort of leaders. And as I was doing that work, and it was significant effort to do that work, I realized this is incredible information. I mean, these leaders, they happen to be women leaders, but these leaders are sharing these candid stories and these lessons learned. And women specifically don't tend to share their stories as much. We're culturally brought up to be more modest or more reserved. And I think that it's so important, not just for women to hear those stories, but for men to hear those stories, and really to help to understand how we can develop organizations that allow everybody to contribute to their maximum potential.
I'm going to circle toward the end about my own book and the interviews of the 10 women there, because they're smashing the myths of women in business.
Uh-huh.
And we'll come back to it, but I want to stay on your own journey. So,
Sure.
are there pieces as you're telling the story of these other women, your own story was coming together? And I don't want to lose the grit factor itself, but what did
Yeah.
you learn in the military and then in business school to sort of blend the two? How do you lead different venues? Some of the things that you observed and want to share.
Those are really great questions. I will say that part of the work of the Grit Factor for me, and when I was serving in the military, there were very infrequently other women around that were either of the same and never of greater rank, because there just hadn't been women that had come through this field before. And so remember the 90s, we didn't have the internet, right? So I think now it's so hard to explain that, wow, these stories just weren't available, because there were women that had done incredible things in the past, right? The WASPs in World War II, and actually these early women general officers were attending West Point in the 80s when I was still in high school.
Yes.
So it's so they were there, but we didn't know about them. And again, women don't share their stories, and I don't think our culture shares those stories either, except for kind of a tidbit in a local newspaper, right? Which is a very different thing. So the ability to connect, to find these stories, to share these stories, but then also to integrate them into my own understanding of my experience, to your point, has been very powerful for me. I almost feel like I've gained strength in retrospect in understanding my experience in the context of all of these other leaders that were doing work, some of them earlier, some of them at the same time, and I just didn't know about them. And so the sisterhood, I guess, that has, I think, now formed around some of there's now a Chick Fighter Pilot Association, for example, which is just awesome. But there was nothing like that when I was in. And so I'm so grateful for that opportunity to try to understand my own experience, but also feel this camaraderie that was missing when I was in. So having said that, the grit factor ended up being shaped by the key themes that came out not only of my own experience, but of these several dozen other women that I had the chance to interview. And they were really those themes that showed up again and again and again, and ones that I hadn't internalized enough to be able to share them in the context of this kind of a narrative, and this kind of a narrative that is backed by all of the research that supports it as well, of course. And so that's where it really ended up breaking out into sort of 3 phases. The training is aligned this way too, and going for grit at the Grit Institute. But first we have commit, and then we have learn, and then we have launch. And commit is really doing some pretty deep introspective work. And I will tell you, this is not work that I had done when I was a young officer, when I was a young leader. It is work I think some of the young leaders today are doing, and to the benefit of themselves, to the credit of the military, I think, and to their credit. But I had not done that work. And so it's interesting to go back and look at how important that is, and to feel really excited about the chance to offer that recommendation to others. And that's really owning your own story, looking at the arc of your life, those things that have happened to you, how those have formed your values and helped you to understand your strengths and your weaknesses, and then drilling down to core purpose, which I think is really the anchor that underpins everything that it is that we do. The second phase is learning. And one of the things that's so interesting that came out of interviews, especially with senior women officers, so senior generals especially, is the art and the science of listening, which is something that most of us don't do well, and especially leaders that have a bias towards action, which has often served many of us very well. But the art and science of listening is something I will say that I still struggle with. And so being able to delve into that, and also seeing those themes, by the way, picked up at business school, was interesting. Building your team is another big piece of that, and knowing who should be on that team, whose team you should be on to help, which both helps you and helps others, and who should not be in your circle. And then finally is building resilience and building grit, which is something we can talk more about, but absolutely something that can be done. I pull from the Army's Master Resilience Training Program, which is all drawn from the University of Pennsylvania positive psychology work that's been done over the last 20
that's
years.
great. That is great.
Really.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, Martin Seligman stuff, huh?
Exactly. Right. No, it's very powerful, and it's really important for people to understand they can do that. There's some mindset piece of that too, with kind of some of the work from Harold. And then the last piece is really starting to think about audacity, asking for what you want, being willing to put yourself out there. Something, again, good for men and women, but women tend to do that less naturally. Authenticity, sometimes very difficult in fields where you're the first one, but absolutely critical for sustainable leadership. And then finally is adaptability. And I think the climate that we're in right now shows how critical adaptability is. I mean, if you put together a tried and true and solid foundation, but you're not able to adapt to changing circumstances, it simply isn't going to work. So that's really how things break out with commit, learn, and launch. And again, that comes from not only my own experience, but the synergies between my own experience and that of these other incredible leaders.
Now, as you're thinking about it, your experiences in Microsoft and gave you a business context for similar challenges, or was leadership easier there or different?
Yeah, I think there are some things that are the same, and the most important things are going to be the same in any environment. I think for leadership, there are certainly things that will differ between the military and the corporate world, but the things that are the same is that I think good leadership is people-centered leadership, always. Yes. It is always about taking care of people. And I like to tell this story about when I was a young lieutenant and I was being promoted from second lieutenant to first lieutenant. My very first battalion commander, who was a wonderful leader, and my father was there down from Alaska because he happened to have a business trip nearby. And so they pinned on my silver bars of the first lieutenant, which is sort of like your driver's permit, is how I think about it, to your advanced driver's permit. And I remember him saying, the only good use of any increased power is the increased responsibility to take care of your people. And I learned from him that leadership was a sacred trust. And I will say that is something that was true in Microsoft as much as it was true in the military. And the good leaders did it well and the bad leaders didn't. And so if there were one thing that you could take away about leadership, it's that it has to be looking at taking care of people.
Now that's very important. And overall, I'm thinking about my own leadership academies because that's, actually we're doing a workshop, not this month, the next one on fans, followers. And leaders need followers. And what is the relationship of the two? What's your responsibility to them and them to you? Because it's not just one way. And I think this sacred importance of it, the trust of taking care of others, and then others. You if you're a leader, you've also been a follower, and so there's lots of learning on both sides. Some perspective from that, because I'm picking your brain as I'm thinking about my own clients. I mean, this is a time to think about how do we lead and how do we build those people who count on us, and we need them to trust.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is, I mean, we used to say mission first, people always in the military, right? And when you take care of your people, they take care of the mission. And I remember at Microsoft, actually, I had an incredible team in this customer experience measurement field in the services side of Microsoft. And I won't back up, but I'll just say that this comes from an experience from the military as well. But I had the chance to help one of the young, very hard workers that I had, this incredible guy that worked on databases in ways that I could never even begin to understand even what he was doing, but I relied on him for his exceptional work. And I remember he was taking a honeymoon, and he wanted to go for 2 weeks, but he had 1 week of leave. And I said, you know what, listen, I've got these leave forms here. You go for 2 weeks. If something happens in the first week, then I sign it, and that's great. If nothing happens in the first week, then we use the second leave form. And the thing is, he had earned that, right? And I had learned over now, by then over a decade of working with people, that when people do good work, you take care of them, and when you take care of them, they do excellent work. And that's just something that, especially when it comes to something really important and personal, you need to know about it, and you need to take care of them. And I will say that on the flip side of that, there were times with less stellar employees in both the military and at Microsoft where there's some tough love that happens too. And that's part of taking care of people, is making sure they're in the right place, not in the wrong place, right? And so that sometimes means helping people move on and find another opportunity. So it's not all roses, but it is still the foundation, I think, of what good leadership is. It's setting a vision, but it's taking care of people and helping them get to that vision, because everybody really wants to contribute. They want to be doing meaningful work. And so when I talk about finding your own core purpose, I think what a leader has a chance to do to encourage people to do this exceptional work is helping them do that introspective work and tie their own core purpose to what the purpose of their organization is. And if you can make that link for them, help them make that connection, gosh, they'll go anywhere for you. They'll go a million miles.
Well, it's interesting because people make decisions with the heart and the gut, and then the head comes into play. What you're describing is how to build a team where you're leading others who care about each other in the heart.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not the mission up here, perhaps. It's the feeling that we belong to something bigger than ourselves and have a purpose that's beyond the job to be done, but it has a multiplier. It's a very interesting cultural reality that expands here. I'm in awe of what Microsoft has been able to do as it's transformed itself, and as you're thinking. So out of all of this has come this Grit Institute in the book. I think it's a good time to share with the listeners. I see the stages. Is the Institute here now to take this? Are you doing it in person or remotely? How is this working?
Yeah, so right now, the Grit Institute, the training structure, the training Going for Grit is available, and it's available to anybody. So you can jump on right now. It's at a discounted price until the book is published. So get on now to make sure you take advantage of it at thegritinstitute.com. So Going for Grit is the training. It's approximately 15 hours in 6 weeks, depending on how quickly you like to work. But there are short videos that support the worksheets and the reading reflections that go along with it. And I guide you through those stages. And so that's the current online offering. For larger groups and organizations, what I would do is to work with them to meet their goals. So that might mean that they would like to bring a bigger group together, establish a cohort. I can kick it off with a webinar, and then they can we can set up cohorts where people check in at the end of each week. There might be a smaller leadership team that you really want to work hard with, and we do a webinar every week to walk people through the program. So essentially, it's a framework that can be used in a number of different ways, both for individuals, but also for organizations. And it's really exciting to me because it really is the fundamentals of what I cover in the Grit Factor, but with the training, I can also tailor that to an organization to make sure that we're aligned with their values, their objectives, what it is that they want their people to get out of that. And that is really a lot of fun to me to make that relevant for individual groups.
Because I do work similar to yours differently, how well aligned is the vision of what they want and the leadership and the way people work? I find there's also a big gap between those top of the line who are articulating it and how it comes down into the middle leadership, it used to be middle management, and then how it gets down and actually implemented. It's a bad telephone game. And in the absence of training, there's no good way to develop the skills and perspective needed. But as I'm listening to you, is there something that you can do to make sure it all filters down and they actually live it?
Well, that is such a good question. And it's so interesting because I just had a totally fascinating conversation on Friday with somebody about how all this science is out there, but people aren't putting it into practice. And why are we not putting it into practice when it's available to us? And so I do think what you're describing from a much larger organizational level, I think is really looking at cultural transformation as well. And I think there's an opportunity, and we're early enough in this process that I've not yet done this with a company, but I'm excited to be doing this kind of a work, is to say, hey, let's work it with the leadership team, and then let's look at how we make this part of your program, how we integrate this into your leadership journeys that you already have established. And that's where the real magic is going to happen, actually. I think there's real magic that will happen standalone. Like if you go in as a consumer and you sign up for Going for Grit, I think you will get a tremendous value from it. And in fact, I wish that I had had this at various earlier stages of my life, right? You write the book that you wish that you had read or that you'd know that others read. But I think from an organizational perspective, there's a real opportunity to use this and to integrate it into the journeys that they already have structured, or to help them structure a journey around that. So you're right, that's where the real magic has an opportunity to happen from a larger organizational perspective. And it'll be so much fun to be able to work with people to make that happen.
It's interesting because with remote work today, many of my clients who have most of their folks working remotely have a desire to pull them back together, many ways because they are unable to visualize how they are going to get work done remotely.
Yeah.
Is there some wisdom you can bring to them from your own experiences in the Grit Factor about how they can relax, how they can begin to see a future, how they can change the way they communicate? There was a great story. I don't remember the company, but the gentleman was over managing his remote staff and over commanding and controlling it. It's the only way I could describe it. And he wasn't really being an entrepreneur, empowering them and giving them good direction and holding them accountable, much less working in a remote team setting. He didn't really have any skills. He knew one way and it wasn't working. Finally, they pushed him back and said, let us do our job. And they all did it. And they didn't do it badly. They did it well. It was an interesting sort of aha. From your perspective, remote work is just another style of work, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And how do we get it done?
Well, and I think there's several things at play here. One is getting used to an entirely new modality for a number of people. Now, I have been doing remote work for some time, and my husband similarly manages a distributed team, so we're pretty comfortable with that. But I will say that the rhythm of remote work, I think, has to communicate more. That doesn't mean direct more; it means communicate more.
Yes, listening.
And listening, yeah, exactly, listening. And I think that is a big key, right? And that's what I was telling people a couple of months ago as we were getting into the modality, is ask the questions and then open the space for people to respond and listen and understand that Now, this is always true, but especially now, needs are both personal and professional, right? There are people with elderly parents that can't visit, or with young children who are running around that you're homeschooling at the same time as you're managing your company. And I can speak from personal experience on that one. But all of us can now, right? We all have some kind of personal aspect that is part of this. And the reality is, it's always been there. If
Yes.
that's part of the whole leader piece, the whole person piece, that I think we haven't paid enough attention to in the past. And that
Yes.
doesn't mean you flush the mission, but it does mean you say, hey, what do you need to be able to
Yes.
do your job optimally right now? And it's going to look very different than it did 6 months ago. And that's okay. And give that space to that, and then give them the chance to respond. So that's number one. Communicating more often is number two, I think, in this modality. Trying to find some ways to make it fun. I also chair a nonprofit board, and I've just been trying to think of ways to make these Zoom meetings more fun. And there's some fun icebreaker type exercises you can do even on Zoom that allow for greater connection. And that's pretty neat to be able to be a little bit creative that way. But over communicate versus under communicate, listening is really, really important.
Yeah.
But I want to come back to your other question, because I just talked to another client the other day, and she was talking about how tired people are. And they're tired because, in part, we're missing that certainty that we crave. I mean, it's very natural psychologically, right? To need to know what's happening. And we don't know right now. We don't know the next month. We don't know the next year, to be frank. Maybe not even the next 2 years. And that's really disorienting. And so I recommended two things. And the first thing is to just stop, because I think all of us are feeling buffeted by the news and the uncertainty and the unrest, and it's legitimate. There is uncertainty and unrest, but just stop and turn inward a little bit more instead of outward, looking for that horizon outward, and do that introspective work. That's the first part of the Grit Factor. That's the first part of the Grit Institute. Maybe it's your own work that's separate from that, but give yourself the time and the space to reconnect to what's important, to reconnect to your own values, to your core purpose, because that is your anchor through all of these times. The second piece is that you've got to be able to look forward to something, but you can't be unrealistic about that, right? And there's a great story, and many of you may know this story, many of your listeners may know this, especially through Good to Great, Jim Collins' leadership classic, but there's a story of Admiral Stockdale. And he was a prisoner in the Hanoi Hilton for 7.5 years. And Stockdale had no idea if or when he would ever be released. He was the senior prisoner, so he was horrendously tortured. His legs were broken a couple of times. He was often in solitary confinement. And when he was finally released, they said, what was the difference between those who survived and those who didn't? And he said, oh, it's easy. It's optimism. And now initially your response is, well, wait a minute. Like, optimism is absolutely critical. And I believe it is foundational to success. If you don't have a positive outlook, you're not going to go anywhere. But the key is grounded optimism. And so I use the term grounded optimism in the Grit Institute that surrounds everything else that we do. And that means that you're optimistic within your locus of control, right? I mean, there's a whole nother aspect about risk taking, but right now, look at what's within your locus of control, those things that you can control. Maybe you can look forward to training to run a 5K. That's something you can do within your locus of control, no matter what else happens in the world. Maybe you can learn to draw. Maybe you can look forward to a trip in 3 years with your family and start to plan that trip, start to do some reading around it. So you're looking forward to something that is within your locus of control. And I think that allows some agency that we've all been missing lately. And so that would be the place that I would start. I would start with some introspective work on core values and core purpose, giving yourself the time and space for that, giving your people the time and space for that, and maybe even guiding them through that. And then really allow yourself that grounded optimism to look forward to something that you know is possible.
What's interesting as I listen to you is that there's a vacuum. I'm a vacuum filler. I'm a gap filler.
Yeah.
And you're identifying the gaps that people don't have to live within this different social life.
Yeah.
That they don't have the routine of going to work every day, which makes their habits are getting frustrated. They wake up in the morning with a battle going on between, that's what I'm supposed to do, that's what I'm doing, this doesn't feel right, it's all feeling. And this gap needs to be filled, and nobody's filling it. Yeah. They're talking about when we can come back to work, not what do I do now? And whether
Right.
I come back to work or not, what do I do now? How do I use the time and the space to be purposeful and find the gratification that I've done and made a difference here? And it's you're not alone. There are just millions of people who are doing this, and so you
That's
don't
right.
have to do it alone. But you're also giving them a how-to in a very simple way. So I love this introspection time.
Yes.
It's a leader or anybody. It's a good time to pause, take a short walk. I love the way the brain quiets down when you take a thought walk.
So
Just go
true.
out and walk by
Yep.
yourself. And
Yep.
it's a great way to quiet the body, let it think about things through a whole fresh lens,
Yep.
and then begin to think about what do I have to learn to do something now to fill up the time in a different way. Whether that's parenting my parent who can't come and visit, but I can do
Yep.
things. I can show them. I had one situation where a grandchild went over to the grandparent and showed her how to use Zoom on an iPad that they got her.
Oh, that's
And,
great.
and they were both masked and they both realized that we could do this.
Yeah.
And so that gave, a gift. And then my clients who had kids at home had husbands at home and had to begin to use space differently, but
Yes.
also began to realize I have to help each other. He can't sit
Yes.
on the couch watching TV while the kids are arguing and she's on the client phone call. There's a
Exactly.
lot of new stuff to come, but you can do it. And that's the most important time is you can. And that's
Yes.
what we're all learning with a little grit and resilience, and I can do it, right?
Yes, exactly. No, I mean, it's certainly a good time for grit. And I think there's the idea of stepping back a little bit too is saying you don't just grit through things, right? Again, grit it's part of a whole system, and you have to honor that system. And that might mean taking a step back for a moment and not just pushing through something. But I think there's incredible opportunity in this as well. And this is where the mindset piece is so important, is understanding that when you build grit by doing things that require grit, right? I talked at West Point a couple of years ago, and we talked about how you build the ability to do push-ups by doing push-ups. Well, you build the ability to get through hard things by doing hard things of
Yes.
whatever kind that is. And so having that mindset that pushing through challenge, that negotiating challenge is making you better, is
Yes.
actually one of the keys to success. This is Carol Dweck's work. But there's also some recent work that I think is totally fascinating. It's so recent it didn't quite make it into the grit factor. And it's looking at Navy SEALs and their perspective on stress.
Yes.
And those Navy SEALs that had the perspective that stress enhances their performance instead of freaking out that stress is going to ruin us and it's going to, hurt our mental health. And I hear all of this right now, kind of this hand wringing of our children's mental health and our mental health, and this is so stressful. But if you have the mentality, if you have the mindset that stress enhances performance, now this is obviously not sustainable in the long term, but stress enhances performance. It did, in fact, enhance performance. It had almost a 54% greater completion rate. It had better task completion results. And actually, interestingly, 60% fewer negative peer evals as well, which really shows that there's better team performance. So the mindset that hard things make us better and that stress can enhance our performance, going in with that belief
Yeah.
really has a lot to do with our success. And I think there are so many opportunities right now in reconnecting to each other in more meaningful ways, both at work and at home, because we have to. And that's a good thing. I think we'd lost some of that before. So
Well,
let's really,
you're turning lemons into lemonade, limes into margaritas, and quite frankly, things that like stress can really make you rise to the occasion in new ways, which is important. We're just about out of time. I could keep talking, and I'm not going to because I do think that our listeners are entitled to a good wrap up. 2 or 3 things you don't want them to forget. I've made my list of 10, but you can share with them the ones that it's interesting listening to you because you're very different spokesperson for leadership attributes. I
mm,
will say this gently, than the guys I listen to.
uh-huh.
Very different. You're talking about social relationships, and I'm really excited about what I'm hearing because the women who were told they couldn't lead and have led well do it differently. But
Yes.
help our listeners. A couple of things you don't want them to forget as we wrap up here.
Sure, absolutely. I think the things not to forget, Andy, and this is in part because of when you and I are talking. This is not the beginning of the pandemic. We're now well into it, and there isn't an end in sight necessarily. And people are very tired, right? And
Yes.
they're tired because of this lack of certainty. So I would say really that what I hope that your listeners will take away is that it's okay. And not only that, it's important to take some time to do some of your own work, to go
Yes.
back in and reconnect to core values, to reestablish your core purpose. I think that's absolutely critical. The second piece is that, and this goes back to the relationship piece, whether this is as a leader of people, whether this is in your family, is spending time as well on those social relationships, because none of us do this alone. I have a whole chapter on building your team and who needs to be on your team and the grit factor, right? That's also part of the training, because we don't do this alone. And so
Yes.
really ensuring that you're spending time, and I'm just going to focus on the listening piece. There are many aspects of a relationship, but I think that's the hard thing for a lot of us in a
Yes.
world that has been so fast paced, is building your ability to listen and ask questions and wait for that response. I think whether that's your team or your family, I think that's really, really critical. And then the last thing is the mindset piece. I think the mindset piece, as you approach all of this, know that going through difficult, challenging times makes you stronger. It makes you better. And go into it with that idea, not that don't allow yourself to be pulled off in any of these spirals where people are letting themselves get spun out of control, because this can make you stronger and better as a leader, as a person, and that's a really important way to have that kind of grounded optimism as we face any kind of a challenge. So
I'm
I
going to
hope that
emphasize that point a dozen zillion times. You can control your mind.
you can. That's right.
And if you think that this is going to be hard, it will be. If you
Yeah.
think this is going to be a fabulous experience for us to transform our skills and become a stronger person, it
Yes.
will. And it
Yes.
doesn't take, there's no magic pill. There's just a mind map that's there that you can tell a story of hope and opportunity and optimism,
Yes.
or you can tell one of despair and despondence. The mindset is yours to control.
It
And
is.
if you really are going to rise to this occasion, nobody's stopping you from being an optimist who can see possibilities coming that were completely different than you ever expected. And you yourself can be a stronger person with better purpose, leading people and getting the mission done at the same time. Is that what
I
I've
will say,
say?
if you can manage optimism right now, which you can, exactly, you have that ability. I believe strongly the beginning of this book, but this book could spiral right back to it. It really should be more of a spiral anyway, or a circle, is that we own our own stories. We
That's right.
control our own narratives. You don't control what's given to you, but
No.
you do control what you do with it, and you make that decision. And if you don't make the decision, it'll be made for you, but you get to make the decision of how to use that material and craft the
Yes.
life, the story that you want. And that is just, if you're an optimist right now and you understand that and go into it with that mindset, you are a leader. People will
Yes.
follow that because they're desperate for that right now.
And you don't have to be right. You do have to lead with optimism about what's possible and be
Yes,
honest along the way to make corrections, because nobody knows for sure, but nobody ever knew for sure either. And now that
that's
was an
right.
illusion, and this is a new one, and you might as well take the brain and make it happy. Why not? So let me wrap up. It's been a pleasure, absolutely super duper. Shannon Polson has a new book coming out. When will it be available?
September 8th, but it's available for pre-order anywhere books are sold right now.
Well, I think I pre-ordered yours already. So, and mine just came out for pre-order. Rethink, Smashing the Myths of Women in Business is there for pre-order. Amazon loves pre-orders. But what's most important is that Shannon has really taken her life experiences and created a process at the Grit Institute for you, as well as the Grit Factor. And the book will help you really respond to today's challenges in an optimistic way, so that you can introspectively think about who you are, what your purpose is. You can begin to learn and listen new ideas, new ways of doing things. And then you can have a mindset of possibilities. And next thing you know, lemons turn into lemonade. And you say, this was a piece of cake. Entrepreneurs tell us that first the venture capitalists say, oh, that'll never work. And then the other venture capitalists say, oh, that won't ever work. And the third one said, no, that'll never work. And then you make it happen and they say, oh, that was obvious. And it takes an entrepreneur to show all those no's that it's really a
Right.
yes. And so on that note, thanks to all of you for coming. It's always a pleasure. I love your emails. Send them to info@andysimon.com. And if you want to pre-order my book, just go on to Rethink Andy Simon, and it's there for pre-orders. Your pre-orders are, what do they go to? On Amazon or elsewhere?
They can go literally anywhere books are sold. I like to recommend, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, IndieBound, Bookshop is another great place to support your local independent bookstores. And if you want to do a bulk order, porchlightbooks.com also has them available at a discount for bulk orders. But if you come to me at my website at shannonpolson.com, that'll tell you everything you need to know.
It's been so much fun. Everybody stay well, stay happy. It's all in your mind. So enjoy the moment because it's a great one. Take care. Have a great day. Bye now.